The player characters are traveling through the dark woods to confront their nemesis, Strahd von Zarovich, the vampire lord of Castle Ravenloft.
Appropriately, they're beset by minions dispatched by the vampire lord. But a rather routine encounter suddenly goes sideways after the party loses initiative and takes a string of critical hits.
Like all good player characters, though, your players are stubborn. They decide to fight it out instead of flee. But the dice decide to work against them, and these vampire spawn keep bringing them down.
One by one, they are all reduced to 0 hit points. A TPK is imminent. Character arcs are in flux, the quest unfinished, the narrative suddenly cut short.
As the last player character fails their final death saving throw, you think perhaps this could have gone differently. The player characters could have run, after all. They could have maybe decided to throw that risky fireball. And they definitely should have brought more healing magic and potions. But none of that matters now. The campaign comes to a dead stop at the halfway mark.
No worries, everyone had fun, right?
That seems doubtful.
But at least it was a satisfying way to end the campaign.
Really?
No, absolutely not. Today, we're going to look at alternatives to the TPK and ways to keep your game rolling while still rightfully punishing your characters for their folly. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
This week's episode of our show is sponsored by Shepeku.
Shepeku makes some of our favorite maps out there, and we actually both use them a lot in our home games and especially for VTT. But they have now completed the package and just unveiled their new unique tokens in their token builder set.
Shepeku has really upped the game for maps on VTTs, and now they've really upped the game for tokens as well. Because, as you know, if you're using a VTT and you're putting on all your tokens, you really want to have unique tokens and awesome-looking artwork for everything that the player characters are facing to really complete the immersion on that scene. And so Shepeku's actually put together an incredible token builder that lets you choose from monsters, player characters, and NPCs to fully customize them with unique creations, whether it's the border of the token or the gear and the facial features on the token itself.
It's a really fun builder tool to actually play around with because you get to select from a list of what you actually want your monster to be, and then you get to choose variations on what they're wearing, what they look like. It's a lot of fun to customize and build your characters, and you can go so many different directions with it.
It's exactly what you'd expect from Shepeku. They offer so much customization and different variations on all their maps, so it's not really surprising that they have this amazing token builder that lets you have so much customization and variation on the tokens to go on top of them. So you can actually check out a free demo of their token builder as well, and you can sign up for the token builder to subscribe for only $4 a month, which is a real steal. There's currently an early bird offer to get in on the customization features as well, which is a little bit more, but entirely worth it because you get access to their entire back catalog and 5 new tokens every week.
So make sure to check the links below to fill up on all of the tokens that you need for your upcoming games. And now let's start talking about this week's episode.
Okay, so first things first, there's going to be a ton of people in the comments below talking about old school approaches to Dungeons and Dragons where this kind of thing was par for the course. And that's great. We actually love playing games like Morkborg or the Alien RPG or other old school style games where player character death is kind of par for the course and you expect that in Death Trap Dungeons. That's fun. That's a style of play. And that's an old school style that isn't really what we're talking about today with I think regards to a more narrative focused D&D that really it has been the focus of D&D, I would say, since 2nd edition.
When there's games that are set up for character death and everyone goes in knowing that, it's less of an issue. But when the stories that we're telling revolve around the characters and their goals and their heroic quests, which is often the case in 5th edition D&D, it can actually halt the progression of your game.
Yeah, so we're going to set that all aside and say that's a totally valid style of play, and we don't necessarily think that one is better than the other, but the looming threat of a TPK happening is something that still looms over a narrative-focused approach to D&D and TTRPGs, and most D&D campaigns today aren't like a roguelike or a video game where you can simply start things over again. The time investment is a lot higher, especially on the DM.
Current iterations of D&D foster investment in the narrative, and they build for a payoff towards the end of the campaign. Most campaigns can handle an unexpected character death or two, but a TPK is a different matter. When it's not in a climactic battle, the party just loses. So let's start by looking at when a TPK is fun and when it is not fun. And we'll kick things off with, when is a TPK not fun?
So most D&D campaigns today aren't really like a roguelike or a brutally difficult video game where if the player characters fail and die, they simply start over and try again. I've seen people play with campaign concepts where this does happen, but I would consider that a very high concept approach to D&D and definitely not the norm. The expectation generally is if there's a TPK, the campaign is kind of over, which is strange considering the amount of time people invest into their characters and the amount of time that DMs invest in plotting their campaign.
Current iterations of D&D foster investment in the narrative, and they're all building for the payoff towards the conclusion of the campaign. Most campaigns, we often can handle an unexpected character death or two. As a matter of fact, those can be extremely cinematic moments. But a TPK is a very different matter.
And here's the general rule of thumb that I think when we ponder on this matter is you can have a TPK in a climactic battle. But when the party just loses suddenly and unexpectedly against a more routine encounter, you're kind of in this short circuit mode, right? Like again, in the aforementioned example, when the party just rolls badly against random group of skeletons number 38, or when it turns out the visitors at the inn the party are at are actually a group of 4 CR8 assassins who just randomly mop the floor with your fourth level party. These things are not enjoyable experiences for basically anyone at the table.
I think that a lot of times, especially if we're newer DMs, we might throw the wrong monsters at our party. We might over-evaluate the competency of our players, and we might think that they can handle a situation that they can't. As you play longer with the same group of people, you start to sort of find your groove, but a lot of mistakes can happen, and you might not even intend a TPK, and it feels really bad if you have all of this work that you've done to set up this brilliant story with this great villain that you haven't even really revealed yet. And then, yeah, your accidental too strong of an enemy just kills the party, and now there is no story to tell.
Yeah, and so a total party kill, it feels bad when the party dies for nothing, and especially when it feels like there wasn't anything they could have done to prevent it. Like it was just the dice deciding the story is over now. I think that's probably the most miserable example of it. I've played in Adventures League games and I've run Adventures League games where because of the conceit of public play, you're trying to kind of run things by the book and be a little bit more impartial than you might be in a home game. And where, yeah, just one night the dice decided everyone was dying. And that's not particularly enjoyable. It feels really miserable. It kind of feels like when you're playing a board game with somebody who is clearly snowballing and they're going to win, but you still have to like play out the remaining like 20 turns of risk because here you are. It feels really awful, and you can just sense the mood dropping at
Yeah.
the table when it happens. Because I think that as a narrative, the narrative focus of current gen D&D means that if it feels like your characters are just randomly dying for nothing and no reason, it sucks.
It progresses no story elements, it ends the character progression, it amounts to nothing valuable for the campaign that you as a DM are presenting.
I almost think that it's better for us to look at when a TPK actually is fun
Yeah.
because it's I think having thought about it, I think these are like the only situations where it is okay. And
So
almost every other case, it's probably not what your group wants.
So when should you TPK your party? Not on purpose necessarily, but when is it fun to have a TPK impending over your party's fate? The most important statement that I can make about when is a TPK fun is when it means something. The heroic sacrifice that makes a difference. There are so many movies out there that I personally love where a lot of the main characters die. There are spoilers coming if you haven't seen these
Yes,
movies, but
spoilers alert
uh,
for Rogue One, Cabin in the Woods, Hamlet, 300, The
The
Thing.
Thing.
Yeah.
Now, in some of these examples, no, not every single character dies, but there's a large amount of main characters that get wiped out for the sake of a narratively beautiful conclusion. Rogue One is probably one of the best
Yeah.
examples where nobody at the end of Rogue One feels unsatisfied with that ending. But the ending is the amounting of all of the efforts through what we would call the campaign and the adventure to get the characters to a point where they kind of knew what they were getting into and they understood their
Yeah.
fate, but it was important enough that they had a job to do that they knew was going to help a lot of people. So their sacrifice was worth it. And if you get to the climactic part in your campaign where the party's like, we all might die doing this, but it's going to be worth it,
Mhm.
then a TPK is on the table.
Yeah, I also really think of one of my classic examples of this is I actually really like that there was a way that Mass Effect 2 can end with everybody dying
Yeah.
and that final mission really feeling like you're going into it and nobody's coming back from this, but it's still going to accomplish something. And so when the characters' deaths are accomplishing something, it fills that heroic sacrifice sort of narrative and it makes it feel good. And because in that respect, the TPK is actually kind of happening on the party's terms, and there's a lot of foreshadowing that goes into making that have a cool payoff. I will say it's really hard to do. I don't think I've ever like the only time I've ever pulled it off was in the conceit of our time loop campaign,
Yeah.
and even then, we had the time loop conceit that the TPK wasn't a TPK because they just start over again.
I think one element that's important about this is if you were running a story that is similar to Rogue One, you as a DM should not set up the ending of it and be like,
Mhm.
in the end, all the player characters will die. That's for fate and the dice and the system to decide. If you present a very difficult scenario, but it is at the climax and all the characters do die, but they accomplish their mission, if that's just something that's happening at your table, that's the right time. Don't force the TPK.
Yeah, I think it's in the sense that the players have to be on board with the TPK happening. Like they have to feel like they are again, they have to feel like by their character dying, something is being accomplished. Their character is doing something meaningful in the process, and the whole party is essentially winning by losing. And
This
that
isn't to say that parties can't lose.
I think that's the very natural response. It's like, okay, so does that mean that if the party has made a bunch of bad decisions, I now, as a DM, can wipe them out? And I think that this is where you need to be careful about it. Because, again, if the party has made a bunch of has made decisions that we're going to give up our lives doing this, and they kind of go in knowing that, that's cool. Like, go for it, raise the flag, and let them die. But if there's a mismatch in expectations, if and this happens a lot, where the party thinks they've got a good plan, but they don't,
Yeah.
uh, and you feel like you need to now punish their bad decisions. That's where I don't think the TPK is the answer, right? And this is the very fine line I think that we're walking on.
So for me, it isn't necessarily always about the players. Yeah, you don't want to rob the players of their character's journey and their character's story and just end it on a stupid encounter. But it's also taking away a lot from you as a DM. You're a storyteller. You have a narrative that you want to explore. And having your great plans and epic quests just end because the party gets wiped isn't fun for you either.
Hmm.
We want to tell a story with our friends around the table, and we want to tell that story for as long as the story takes to tell. So, what do we do instead in those moments where the battle is just turning in favor of the monsters and the villains, and the party is not doing great? What can we do? Let's present several options, ranging from ones that are really, really tough and difficult to pull off to ones that I think are actually good go tos. And I think we're going to start with what I would call the most iffy option.
Yeah. So if you've got on your hands what looks like a TPK, right? For example, I think this one comes up a lot with people playing Drakenheim because Drakenheim's a pretty brutal campaign as we've written it. We actually give the DMs the advice to not be afraid of a TPK if it feels appropriate, but it still has to be the summation of the player character's choices. If you're staring down the barrel of a TPK, you can fudge it and you can bail them out if you don't want it to happen. You can always pull your punches, you can fudge those dice, you can zero out the monster's hit points, and you can manipulate the situation so that the player characters could come out on top. The next hit the monster takes, they die.
I would be careful with this one, first of all. I would only do this in a situation where you have severely misjudged the balance of the combat encounter you created. Perhaps you didn't realize that the monster that you picked wasn't CR8, but it was a CR18. Again, newer DM, maybe you throw the
Yeah.
Pit Fiend at your level 6 party and you're like, probably shouldn't have done this.
Yeah.
This is generally not an option that I would recommend unless you really feel like you, the DM, are the one who messed up the encounter. Because if you do it too much, or if you even if you do it once, players will pick up on the fact that you bailed them out, and especially if you're doing it multiple times, it actually is going to take away the agency of your entire campaign. And it's going to tell the players that you're not actually taking this thing seriously and that they can do anything they want without dying. So,
Yeah, it really shatters the illusion of deadliness behind your campaign.
so don't do this unless you're in that moment where you're like, oops, the Pit Fiend was the wrong choice. I have made an error. I'm going to give it half its hit points and they're going to win. I've done that before when I definitely knew that I put a monster that was way too powerful early on in my career.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this doesn't have 400 hit points, it has 200. And then, they still came out of that being like, wow, that was a tough battle. And they never knew that I halved its hit points.
Yeah.
So, again, use this one very sparingly, but it is a tool that you have in your toolbox.
So the next tool that you have in your toolbox, and again, this is another one that can feel like a rug pull, is any situation of there are sudden reinforcements, help arrives, the monsters flee, or what we might otherwise call the Deus Ex Machina, which it refers to um, a phenomenon in ancient Greek theater where one of the gods would be lowered down on a crane, hence God out of the machine, throw a bunch of lightning bolts, and fix the problem for the protagonists. If you didn't know where the phrase comes from, so essentially, it's a variation of the player characters are clearly going to lose, and help arrives to save them, and this really works if the players either called for help themselves, like they had a flare gun to signal for help, or they used a sending spell, or they asked for it, or they knew it was coming, like the Battle of Helm's Deep. But if it just suddenly shows up out of nowhere, it's pretty bad.
If you're a DM and you're out there and you're like, man, I really want to introduce this brand new NPC. He's this hero and he's going to be like a really big ally of the party. So I'm going to orchestrate a situation where the party is going to lose. And on the verge of their TPK, my new big hero shows up and saves
No,
them. That
no,
is a terrible,
no, don't,
terrible way to
don't,
introduce an
yeah,
NPC.
don't ever just don't do this.
Again, it robs the entire agency out of your players. They now it's like, okay, so we were always supposed to
You know how
lose.
you can make that even better? After the NPC saves the party, make them really arrogant and smug about the whole thing, and they start bossing them around. That's your party's new favorite NPC, right? They saved them.
No, no. I
No.
do think
N-
that if you are going to use the Deus Ex Machina scenario, You want the players to have earned it. I think if the players have worked to create allies,
Yeah.
they talked to those allies. They said, "Hey, allies that we have worked really hard to make, we are about to go fight the dragon. Any chance you could help us?" And the allies might say, "We aren't sure if we can help you. We have a lot going on here, but we know where you're headed. If we have reinforcements to spare, we will send them." What you've now set up is a possibility that they could show up. And then you could do, if the party's like facing the dragon and the dragon's just way too powerful, you could have Gandalf show up on the hilltop on the eve of the third day and be like, "I'm here to help with the dragon." And it's the allies that the party was like, "Oh man, I'm glad that we saved that entire city and helped those people and gave them money and I don't know, whatever it is that they did to secure these allies." I think that is when you can pull out the the heroes showing up to save the party, but it has to be earned by the party.
Yeah. Another kind of hybrid between these ones is the bad guys run away. And the issue with the bad guys running away one is you as a DM have to kind of be embodying that style of play for a while. If you suddenly if your monsters have always fought to the death against the player characters and all of a sudden with two player characters bleeding out on the ground, the monsters suddenly decide to run away, the players are going to be like, what? We were clearly losing. But if you have a group of intelligent, usually humanoid NPCs and foes that are fighting the party that value their own lives, there's a lot of circumstances where in real life, in a 4v4, two might be dead on one side, two might be dead on the other side, and the two that like they might decide we're not sticking around
Yeah, we
because
don't
we're
want
not
to.
we're
Yeah.
not gonna we're not willing to risk our own lives. So morale can be a factor, but you have to have established that morale is something that you're actively thinking about as a DM for a while. Like it's never one of those things that you can use to bail everybody out. It's again related to the fact that like with the fleeing and the fudging it, you kind of have to have established it that the bad guys might run because it's yeah, sometimes they'll be like, we were half dead and they ran away. Why?
Yeah. Now, the other side of this same option is to let the players run away. And this
Players don't run away.
and that's the thing. Okay, that's the thing I want to talk about. Players don't often run away.
No.
They're stubborn, and I rarely like to leave a fight if I can help it. I will fight till I'm at one hit point and still think that the rest of my party is going to save me and help us win.
I think the only time I've seen you guys run from an encounter is when you still won in the process, right? Like when you've got what you came for and you stole the thing and
Yeah.
you're running away with the thing that you wanted, right?
So I will say like parties aren't going to run, but that's why if your party does decide that they're gonna actually run away, if they're doing this and they're, like, abandoning their allies.
I have
Oh,
not seen that often.
yeah, I mean, that's the hard part. If they're doing it, they're probably not abandoning allies, they're probably not giving up on a quest, they're probably not like.
Like I've seen it in games that aren't D&D.
Yeah.
Like we've had it happen in games of Alien
Well, in
where
Alien,
yeah,
it's like it's always run away.
yeah.
It's everybody runs as soon as the alien
Yeah.
shows up,
But
leaving one person to get, like,
but in
mauled.
D&D I've like I don't I think I've maybe seen it once where the party left someone to die. Yeah, I think that was Elder Room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we left him. But that was a situation where a whole army caught up to
Yeah.
him, and and he was like, "I'll fight them off," and we were like, "All right, man, see ya." Um, but if they do decide to run, you can make the choice of not having the foes pursue, and it creates a situation where their flight can be successful. And I personally think that this is actually a great way to reward players for choosing to run if they are smart enough to be like, "We are losing this situation." Especially what I do as a DM is I actually, surprisingly, the players at my table run all the time.
And I think that you have to actually because they don't do it a lot and they won't do it if not prompted, you kind of have to reward players when they run by letting them get away.
And what's really important about at my table is oftentimes, like, in one of the game sessions I ran recently, they were facing a threat in Drakkenheim that was, like, too big for them. They had gotten themselves into a bad
Mhm.
situation because of a random encounter. And so the druid asked, like, if I turn into an elk, can the two little, like, there's two halflings in our party, can the two halflings ride me out of here? And I was like, yeah, that works for me because what ended up happening is one of the halflings ended up blowing a spell slot to like create a barrier.
Yeah.
And then the druid used a wild shape, and then the two of them hopped on her back and they escaped. And I was like, they blew through resources and they got the heck out of there. I'm going to reward that, especially if they're using their resources to do it. Then, yeah, let them escape.
It's really easy as a DM to get into this mindset that like you can't let them escape, but then at this in the same breath, you'll have DMs complain that their players never run away from too dangerous threats. So be mindful of this. And again, this is double so I think for Drakenheim, which again, if you're trying to run that sort of deadly campaign where you want your players to approach situations intelligently and consider fleeing from battle, you got to kind of let it work.
Yeah.
Because if running away never works, then they're never gonna run away because they know they're dead anyways.
And I think that running away still instills in the party, like, there is this weird sense of like, man, we didn't succeed.
Yeah,
And that's really what you want out of the whole TPK scenario is like, you want the players to feel like they didn't quite do their best. And when you run away, you don't feel like you did your
yeah.
best. You're thankful that you lived, but there is that feeling of like, oh man, we got to do better next time. And that's what we're trying to capture.
Now, what I will say is that I do believe in a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, like shame on me sort of thing. So if I have told my players that I'm running a deadly campaign and communicated that to them, I generally go with like a two strikes rule. Like the first time I'll kind of be merciful.
Mhm.
The second time I'm not gonna.
And that's fair,
Yeah.
especially if it's the exact same mistakes that they've
Yeah.
made. I also think this one is one that I implement all the time for another way to avoid a TPK. I generally write all of my encounters to have a wave of enemies show up in the second or third round of combat.
Hmm.
It's quite normal that like, okay, uh you're fighting in the throne room. The extra guards of the castle are going to show up on round 3.
Yeah.
Um the players don't know that those extra guards are going to show up on round 3, and I've had many situations where even in a pre-written campaign, it says if a fight breaks out in this room, the whatever monsters in this room are alerted to it and will come and help out. But your players don't need to know that, and you as a DM get to make the very easy call, and this one you can pull off super easily of just not having the monsters show up.
Yeah.
Um, I do it all the time where like my players are fighting the one scary monster and they are sweating. They're having a bad time. Their hit points are draining. They're pushing as hard as they can. And I get to the moment where I'm like, oh, it says here that 8 more monsters are supposed to show up. And I just go, nah, they're having a hard enough time. I'm just not going to.
Okay, so related to that and the fudging, how do you feel about this? The monster's breath weapon recharges, but you don't use it. Or the party is losing badly, and you know the Lich still has another use of chain lightning, but you don't use it. Or the ravenous monster that loves eating people doesn't start eating the bleeding out body of the down PC and goes for the next living like essentially suboptimal tactics.
Can I be real with you? I've used all of them.
Yeah.
And especially in my home games. And this is something that I want to talk about again. Like, I just ran Alien RPG for you guys. I was ready to brutally murder. I was luckily one of our players did something crafty that I thought was crafty enough to warrant
Yeah.
me to change the situation. But if people don't change the situation in a game like Alien, I'm ready to rip players
Yeah.
to shreds. But and I want to come back to this point. When I'm running my home game of D&D, I'm there to have as much fun telling the story as the players are. And so I've definitely had it where like, okay, the dragon's breath weapon just recharged, and I'm looking at the characters and they have like 20 hit points, 8 hit points, 4 hit points. And I'm like, okay, I could wipe them right now,
Yeah.
but like who's having fun if I do that? Is it me? The answer is no. So like for myself, and there are DMs out there who do enjoy this, and there are tables out there who do enjoy this. For me personally, wiping them with the breath weapon that just recharged doesn't sound fun for them, and it doesn't sound fun for me.
Yeah,
So I don't do it.
it's the same vein of where like focus firing the PCs Like focus fire is a good strategy for player characters to employ, but like, man, is it brutal when that gets deployed on the PCs,
Yeah, and
right?
I always
Yeah.
look for like, because it's turn-based, what I'll often do is the easy way to pull the punch is like the dragon has one character pinned and is about to bite their head off. And then the wizard casts an attack spell. And then I'm like, okay, the dragon turns and looks at you now.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's a valid reason to pull away from the player that was about to die. But now you also like, do you kill the wizard? Because we are talking
Yeah.
about TPK scenarios. And so, like, that's where it gets tough, but I will often avoid, like, I don't know, I've seen a spellcasting character have, like, 2 uses of their Finger of Death or something, and I've been like, I use it once at the beginning, and then I'm like, "Oh, I could use it again on the same character." Like, no, I don't know.
It's tricky too because it also comes into like, are all foes of the players going to approach every battle with cold rationality and brutal efficiency? No, like they don't have to be operating at like 100% tactical acumen at all times, and in some cases it's not even appropriate for them to do so. And so they can do things that are more informed by rage or curiosity or retribution or annoyance or otherwise. Like, just like a cat might play with their food sometimes too. But yeah, it's a slippery slope, and I think that there is a certain point where just like with the pulling the punches, you always have to assess like there's a certain point where the players know it's happening.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I really like, this is an alternative to the running away or having the bad guys flee and give up. And this is a really cool thing to do with your players if you've never done it before, because players don't expect this kind of thing. If you have a player character go down and the fight is going badly for them, and they're fighting against intelligent foes, have one of the bandits or enemy soldiers go over to one of the down PCs who's bleeding out unconscious, grab them by the hair, lift their blade up to their neck, and tell the rest of the party, I'm going to finish them off unless you surrender.
That actually one of our first TPK scenarios in Drakkenheim was essentially this, where, I think it was Pluto is like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, okay,
Yeah.
we surrender." And it was such a beautiful scenario where you gave us the opportunity, and by all means, that's a loss for the party.
Oh,
The
oh,
pa
oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
party loses that combat encounter in the same way that a TPK would make them feel like they lost, but without halting the story or finishing off these well-worked characters, it just gives you that sense of, like, "We're done for, like, this is
Mhm.
it." But you get to move on to the next step.
Yeah. Now, I have had some situations where the archer in the party decides to take the shot. And I've seen that go both ways.
Yep, yep. You gotta be real.
Yeah.
This ain't no action movie. It might not go the way you want it
Yeah.
to.
And or sometimes it is.
Yeah.
It's like
Sometimes it is the
yeah,
action movie that goes exactly right.
sometimes it is the Batman dilemma where he can save Robin and the
Who
other.
will you save?
Yeah,
Both of them
yeah,
because I'm Batman.
yeah, right?
Anyway.
But it can still be a really cool moment, and it can be a cool way to, um, de-escalate, like, to change a combat encounter. It doesn't de-escalate it, but it veers the escalation in a different way,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and, allows, combat to suddenly turn into, like, a really tense negotiation.
I wanna bring it to, I think, what the most valuable tool is. So, out of all the options presented, some of them are trickier than others, some of them are situational. This is one that you can actually use whether you're using intelligent creatures or not, and I wanna get to that in a second, but capture them.
Mm,
I think capturing your party is, again, a loss, even in the situation where, you have the player and you're like, surrender or I cut their throat. And the party's like, okay, we surrender. This could then lead to a capture them situation. Many monsters, and especially the main villains of your campaign, are intelligent and may want something from the players. Could be information, could be to use them in some grand sacrifice, or to blackmail or exploit them against their foes. I think that also if you're running a campaign that has faction intrigue, where there are multiple
Yeah.
possible villains, this works really well for the exploitation angle because maybe they've chosen, like, we don't like this faction and we're going against them. We haven't made up our mind about faction B and we're working with faction C. But then faction A says, we've got you now. You're going to take down faction B, who you haven't made up your mind about, and you're going to do it for us. And the players now have a choice of like, okay, do we take that bargain and do something for the bad guys? You can play with that. And I also think capturing them, stripping them of their belonging.
Makes that will make them mad.
It will make them
Yeah.
mad, but like if you really want your party to feel like they lost, take away their stuff
Yeah.
and throw them in prison. It leads to a great escape episode.
It's really interesting too because capturing the player characters is really hard to do when you're trying to do it on purpose.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to capture the player characters to avert a TPK, it's surprisingly easy.
You just,
Uh,
oh, they all went down to 0 hit points. They
y-
wake up in a cell.
yeah, exactly. And so I think that the fun thing about this too is like you unless you're trying to like play your villains like they're the from the evil overlord list where they're like the genre savvy villain. I think that like so much other media gives us examples of like why the villain would want to take the party alive because yeah, they want to drop them in the shark tank with the sharks with the laser beams attached to their heads. Or in the case of like Strahd von Zarovich, Strahd is so evil that death is not enough. Right? Like Strahd wants to like Strahd is more interested in the corruption of the heroes than he is in merely slaying them.
I think another great example of this that works. So there's versions that don't. Obviously, we have the Austin Powers trope of like, what's his name?
Dr. Evil.
Well, Dr. Evil and his son. And
Scott.
yeah, Scott keeps coming out and being like, why don't you just give me a gun and I'll shoot him in the head? And he's like, no, we gotta, and like, there's that whole joke. But I think if we look at an example that actually really works is Jabba the Hutt. Jabba the Hutt has an air for theatrics, and
Yeah.
he has an audience that he wants to like amuse.
He wants to make a point out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he throws them into the Rancor pit to have everybody watch. And then when that doesn't work, he's like, all right, we're flying out to the Sarlacc pit.
Oh my, that's right. He does it twice.
Yeah.
He
He does it twice. Because he's like, no, we're gonna throw you in the Sarlacc pit. And he gives them another chance to
where you'll be
escape.
slowly digested for
Yeah.
1,000 years.
And it's
Yeah.
fine to have a villain who has an air
He
for
does it
theatrics.
twice in the first act.
And both of them work. I'm sorry, but it's a great sequence of events. And boy, does the escape from the Sarlacc pit feel like such an epic moment. And guess what? That was a party TPK that changed into an escape that was great and well orchestrated and like,
Yeah, and the escape is the really cool. Like it does let you have the escape scene,
yeah,
which is really neat. And I think that there's all sorts of like great reasons for that. Like if you're running Tyranny of Dragons, like the Cult of the Dragon wants to sacrifice the player characters to Tiamat because that is a mighty offering to
yeah.
Tiamat.
Is there
Right?
is there a sacrifice that they need to do? And like, okay, I'm gonna use Star Wars again, sorry. But
Okay.
in Empire Strikes Back, when near the beginning, Luke gets smacked in the face by the Wampa.
Didn't want to eat him right now.
Yeah, the
Wanted a
Wampa,
snack for later.
he wakes up and Luke is like stuck in his lair and the Wampa's eating another creature, his tauntaun.
Yeah.
Um, and so like if you have the players fall into a big web and get TPK'd by a bunch of spiders, they wake up in cocoons in the lair of the giant spider because the giant spider just ate.
Yeah.
And this is the tactic you can take with non-intelligent monsters is drag them back to the lair.
Yeah.
And then, you get we wake up in the lair and now we have to get past this monster and escape.
Yeah, and I think even with intelligent monsters that eat people, one of like the really funny conceits that you can always say is that like the dragon likes fresh meat,
Yeah.
right? Like they're not that's why the dragon doesn't kill you right away because they just, there's nothing quite like, freshly
Yeah, they got to
roasted.
keep you on ice and
Yeah,
save you for later.
yeah. Well, although dry aged. Um,
So the point of this is that, like, I think the capture does so many things for you. There's always a reason why the enemies might want
yeah,
to capture the players. What it does is, again, you can strip them of their belongings. If you want them to feel like they lost, it feels like a TPK if you take away their magic items, their spell focuses, and all of their cool stuff. Maybe they're in a chest somewhere and the players can actually get them back, but they might choose like, we just got to get out of here. But then it also sets up your next game session. Okay, so your night ends with the party in a situation where they TPK, but instead of TPKing, you capture them. You now get to be like, all right, I get to throw you in jail, and the players have to figure out how to escape this layer.
yeah.
And that's a really cool plot that still allows them to push the narrative forward and creates this like turning point in the campaign that I think is way cooler than a TPK.
Yeah, and I think it'll like I think that a perspective that we've had on things, especially because we are doing a streamed campaign, where I think that the focus for us is on an unfolding narrative, and not only do we have like the payoff of ourselves to bear in mind, but we have an audience of people that are invested in the storyline. So it changes sort of maybe the conceits that you might be working under, right? It's it does get like even if you think about some of the TV series that have existed where character death is a lot more common in those shows and that foster that anyone can die sort of thing. You can usually see within those shows there is a way that those things are constructed,
Yeah.
right? To create a payoff and to create suspense and to create some surprise and to feel ultimately narratively satisfying.
That's also usually one character at a time. Not
Yeah.
often do you see in the middle of a movie all the main characters die and then you
Yeah.
switch to new main
A-
characters.
and it is really really hard to pull off. Like that I think that's why there's so few examples of things in fiction where the characters lose and die completely. Like Rogue One is such a prominent example, I think, in recent media because it stands out as one of the very few examples that we have. 300 being another one, right? Like, um, I really tried to rack my brain on on a on a good example of a story where the heroes died and failed,
Yeah,
right? Like, not a very common thing. I'd be curious in the comments if you can think of a story where like not only did the heroes die, but they also lost. Um,
that
I'm
seems like
sure there's something out
yeah,
there,
there's
but
probably.
nothing. But like, yeah, uh,
But I think at the end of the day, like the whole point of this is that, again, this advice is for those of you who are running long-term campaigns with character-focused narratives.
yeah.
If you're running a different game, then kill your players. If you're running Morkborg or Alien RPG, murder them all.
And I do think that there is like a medium point
Yeah,
in with all that. Like I think Drakkenheim, especially like for people that are running by the book in a home campaign, I think that there is a more medium point where you still need the danger and the threat of
yeah.
that to be a real thing. But you have levers that you can pull.
And that's what this video is trying to say at the end of the day is you have levers that you can pull if you yourself realize that you're on the verge of a TPK and you know it's not satisfying. You know that this is a boring TPK that does nothing for your story, does nothing for the characters, and you just realize like maybe you made a mistake, maybe they made a bunch of mistakes, maybe the dice are just against them, and you just feel like your story's about to end for no reason. There are a lot of levers that you can pull to shift the situation back into a narrative element that still punishes your players, but doesn't rob them of the story that's being told.
So, one last thing on that note. I've never seen this done. Or maybe I've tried to do it. I've thought about it, but I've never done it. There is the body retrieval squad arc. So, and I've thought about having this in my back pocket where If you do TPK the party, instead of the story ending, you run a one-shot with characters the players make, and their mission is to get the bodies of the players back and
Because they
resurrect
have, like, a cleric that has
Yeah,
resurrection
yeah,
or something, and it's like, "Bring me their bodies, I will bring them
yeah,
back for their
right?
divine purpose."
So that is kind of I've never done that. I've had it written in my notes for a while, along with a couple other like unexpected things. There's a few interesting things that I pulled with character death in our Drakenheim campaign that I won't spoil, but like I kind of am at the point with my own games where like I actually do consider what I would do in these sort of situations, and that's one idea that I've always like thought of like that could actually be cool.
I mean, it kind of happened. We did bring in a new player for
Yes,
an
we
arc to
did, but that wasn't for a total party kill
Yeah, yeah.
situation, right?
As we're coming to the end of this video, I think what I wanna ask the audience out there is, first of all, have you ever had a TPK that just kind of everybody at the table was like, "Oh, that sucked?" And if you are a DM who has pulled some sort of stunt to correct a almost TPK, did it look different than the ones we've presented here? And what did you do to avert the TPK and keep your story going? I'd love to hear about all that in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. We just launched a bunch of brand new rewards for our patrons to bring early access to our YouTube videos. Our patrons are now getting our Drakenheim episodes and our regular YouTube episodes a week ahead of when they air here on YouTube. And at our upper level patron tiers, we're releasing a packet of our Eldritch experiments, which are 5e compatible content from subclasses to feats to spells to adventure hooks and much, much more that you can try out in your games that we might put in our future published books. There's lots more beyond that, so follow the links below to check out our Patreon, and best of all, join our patron-only Discord server where you can hang out, chat with us, and the rest of our incredible community.
And if you want to see us implementing a lot of the stuff that we talked about in this campaign, because our party loses a lot, and Monty has pulled a lot of these on us, you can check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings right here on YouTube. All the previous episodes are right up over here.
And we've got plenty more content on DMing advice and more right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.